Stand on the Brooklyn Bridge walkway. Below you, traffic flows between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Tourists take selfies. Joggers pass by. The stone towers rise like cathedrals, holding steel cables that have supported this bridge for more than 140 years. Beautiful, iconic, a triumph of human engineering. Now look down at the water. Beneath the East River in the mud and bedrock lie the bones of the bridge's real foundation, the men who died building it. 20 workers killed outright. Hundreds more crippled by a mysterious illness they called caisson disease, what we now know as the bends. Men screaming in agony as nitrogen bubbles formed in their blood, workers paralyzed, families destroyed. The engineer who designed it, Emily Roebling, watched the final years of construction from a window, too sick to stand, directing through binoculars while his wife Emily became America's first female field engineer, translating his instructions to the men digging in darkness below the river. This is the story of the bridge everyone celebrates and the graveyard no one mentions, the marvel built on immigrant bodies, the monument that cost $2 a day and everything. The idea started with a frustration so ordinary it's almost funny. Getting across the river was terrible. In the 1860s, if you lived in Brooklyn and worked in Manhattan, you had exactly one option: the ferry. On a calm summer day, the ride was pleasant enough. 20 minutes across the East River watching the city skyline grow closer, but winter changed everything. Ice choked the river, ferries got stuck or couldn't run at all. Sometimes the river froze solid and people walked across on the ice, risking their lives because they had no other way to get to work. The two cities were growing fast. Brooklyn had about 400,000 people. Manhattan had over 900,000. Business flowed between them constantly. Workers, goods, money, all dependent on ferries that stopped working whenever weather turned bad. People had talked about building a bridge for decades. But the East River presented problems that seemed impossible to solve. The river was nearly 16 feet wide at the proposed crossing point. It was busy with constant ship traffic. Building bridge supports in the middle would block the waterway. The currents were strong. The bedrock lay deep beneath mud and silt. No one had built a suspension bridge anywhere close to this scale. The longest suspension bridge in the world at that time spanned about 1,000 feet. This would need to be nearly twice that length. Into this impossible problem walked John Augustus Roebling, German immigrant, engineer, bridge builder, a man who believed that with enough calculation, enough precision, enough will, humans could overcome any physical obstacle. Roebling had already built successful suspension bridges, smaller ones, but they worked. He understood the physics of cables and towers. He knew how to design structures that could handle enormous weight and stress. In 1867, he presented his proposal for a bridge between Manhattan and Brooklyn. The main span would stretch 1,595 feet, the longest in the world. Two massive stone towers, each taller than any building in either city, would rise from the riverbed. Steel cables would suspend the roadway. It would carry trains, carriages, and pedestrians. The design was radical. The scale was unprecedented. The risks were obvious. The cities approved it anyway. The alternative, continuing to depend on unreliable ferries, was simply unacceptable. Brooklyn and Manhattan needed this bridge. The economy demanded it. Progress required it. Construction would take at least a decade. It would require new technologies, unprecedented engineering, and thousands of workers willing to do dangerous jobs for low pay. Roebling promised he could build it. He had the drawings. He had the calculations. He had the confidence of a man who'd never failed at a major project. He didn't know he'd never see it finished. John Roebling began surveying the site in June 1869. He needed exact measurements for where the towers would stand, how deep they'd need to go, where the cables would anchor. He was standing at the ferry slip on the Brooklyn side, taking compass readings when a boat pulled in too fast. The ferry smashed against the wooden pilings. One piling crushed Roebling's right foot. It should have been treatable. A broken foot, some crushed toes, painful but not life-threatening. Doctors wanted to amputate the damaged toes to prevent infection. Roebling refused. He believed in water therapy, natural healing. He insisted his foot would recover without amputation. It didn't. Tetanus set in. Lockjaw. His muscles seized, his jaw clamped shut. He couldn't eat or speak. The pain was extreme. He died on July 22, 1869, 3 weeks after the accident. The bridge was still just drawings and calculations. The project could have died with him. Many people expected it to. John Roebling was the vision behind the bridge, the engineering genius who'd solved the impossible problems. But his son was watching. Washington Roebling was 32 years old. He'd worked on bridges with his father. He'd studied the plans. He understood the engineering. And he'd served in the Civil War, building military bridges under fire, learning to make quick decisions when lives depended on getting things right. The bridge company appointed Washington as chief engineer. Some people doubted him. He was young, untested as a lead engineer on a project this massive. But Washington had one advantage. He'd learned everything from the man who designed the bridge. He knew his father's plans better than anyone else alive. Construction began in January 1870. The first challenge was the most dangerous, building the tower's foundations. The towers needed to rest on solid bedrock, not the mud and silt of the riverbed. That meant digging down through water, through mud, through everything loose and unstable until they hit stone. Roebling's solution was a caisson, essentially a massive upside-down box made of wood and iron. Workers would climb inside, dig out the material beneath, and let the enormous weight of the caisson slowly sink into the riverbed as they removed what was underneath it. But they'd be working underwater. The only way to keep water out was to fill the caisson with compressed air, creating pressure that pushed the river water back. Washington had studied caisson technology in Europe. He knew it worked. What he didn't fully understand yet, what almost no one understood in 1870, was what compressed air did to human bodies when men spent hours working in it, day after day, for months. The Brooklyn caisson was huge. 168 feet long, 102 feet wide, built of yellow pine timber reinforced with iron. The working chamber inside was 7 feet tall, enough room for men to swing picks and shovels, barely. The caisson sat at the river's edge while workers finished its construction. Then, in March 1870, it was launched and floated into position. Stone for the tower would be laid on top of it. As workers dug out material from inside the chamber, the massive weight would push it down into the riverbed. The entrance was through an airlock, a small chamber where workers would wait while air pressure equalized. Going in meant moving from normal atmospheric pressure to higher pressure. Coming out meant decompression. We now know this process requires careful timing. Pressure changes must happen slowly to prevent nitrogen bubbles from forming in the bloodstream. In 1870, no one knew this. Workers climbed in and out based on work shifts, not on what their bodies needed. Inside the caisson, conditions were brutal. The air was thick, compressed, hard to breathe. Your ears popped from the pressure. The temperature was oppressive. Compressed air heats up, and the body heat from dozens of men working in a confined space made it worse. Some days it reached 80 degrees inside, even in winter. Light came from calcium lamps that burned with an eerie, bright glow. The ceiling dripped constantly, condensation from the temperature difference between the compressed air and the cold river above. The work was simple but exhausting. Dig. Workers used picks and shovels to break up mud, clay, and eventually harder material as they went deeper. The debris was scooped into buckets that were hoisted up through shafts to the surface. Every foot down was progress. Every foot down also meant higher pressure needed to keep the water out, and higher pressure meant more danger to the men inside. At first, shifts lasted 4 hours. Men would climb down, work, and climb back up. Some felt fine afterward. Others complained of joint pain, dizziness, trouble breathing. They called it the bends because men would bend over clutching their joints from the pain. Washington Roebling saw the pattern. The deeper they went, the sicker men got. But he didn't fully understand the mechanism. No one did. Medical knowledge about decompression sickness was minimal. The condition had been observed in deep-sea divers and tunnel workers, but the cause wasn't clear. Some doctors thought it was just exhaustion. Others blamed the bad air or the heat. Roebling tried to protect his workers. He reduced shift times as they went deeper, 3 hours, then 2 hours. He made sure the airlocks worked properly. He studied every case of illness, trying to find patterns. But the fundamental problem remained. Men were working in compressed air for hours at a time, then decompressing too quickly. Nitrogen was dissolving in their blood under pressure, then coming out of solution too fast when they surfaced, forming bubbles that blocked circulation, damaged tissue, and caused agony. Some men died in the caisson, collapsed while working. Others died after they came up, hours or days later, from complications no one understood. Some were paralyzed. Some went deaf or blind. Some recovered after weeks of pain. Some never recovered at all. The immigrant workers, mostly Irish, Italian, German, kept going down. They needed the money. $2 a day for caisson work. That was better than factory wages, better than construction work on the surface. Dangerous, yes. But poverty was also dangerous. At least this danger paid. By November 1870, the Brooklyn caisson had reached bedrock 44 feet below the surface. Workers had dug through mud, clay, and sand to hit solid stone. The foundation was secure. 27 workers had been seriously injured. One had died from the bends. Washington called it a success. Now they had to do it again on the Manhattan side, and that would be worse. The Manhattan caisson was even larger than Brooklyn's, 172 feet long, 102 feet wide. It was launched in September 1871 and floated into position. The riverbed on the Manhattan side was different. The bedrock lay deeper, much deeper. Washington's surveys suggested they might need to go down 70 or even 80 feet to find solid stone. That meant even higher air pressure. It meant longer exposure times. It meant more danger for every man who climbed down into that compressed chamber. The work began the same way, men digging, shoveling, hauling debris up in buckets. The caisson sinking slowly inch by inch as tons of granite for the tower were laid on top. But as they went deeper, something changed. At 50 feet down, men started getting sick more frequently. The joint pain was worse. Some men couldn't walk when they came up. They'd crawl out of the airlock, gasping, clutching their knees or elbows. At 60 feet, men were dying. The symptoms were unpredictable. 2 men could work side by side for the same shift. One would climb out fine. The other would collapse hours later, screaming, unable to move his legs, blood vessels bursting in his eyes. Washington tried everything he could think of. He cut shift times again down to 1 hour for the deepest work. He improved ventilation. He studied medical journals from Europe about caisson disease. He consulted doctors. Nothing really helped. The only thing that reduced sickness was limiting time in the compressed air. But that made the work slower, more expensive, and increased the pressure to keep men working longer to stay on schedule. And then Washington himself went down into the caisson. He needed to inspect the work directly. He needed to see conditions firsthand. So he descended into the compressed air chamber and spent several hours examining the excavation, talking to workers, making notes. He came back up and felt fine initially. Then the pain started. Joint agony, dizziness, paralysis spreading through his legs. He couldn't stand. He couldn't think clearly. The pain was beyond description. He survived, but he never fully recovered. The damage was permanent. He'd be weak in pain, partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. By February 1872, Washington Roebling couldn't visit the construction site anymore. He was bedridden most days, able to sit up for only a few hours at a time. His vision was damaged. His memory was spotty. The man who'd led the project for 2 years was now a semi-invalid. The bridge company considered replacing him, but Washington had something no replacement could match. He understood every detail of the design. He carried the bridge in his mind. His wife Emily had a different idea. Washington couldn't come to the bridge, so she would go to the bridge for him. Emily Warren Roebling was 30 years old in 1872. She'd married Washington in 1865, shortly after the Civil War. She traveled with him to Europe when he studied caisson technology. She'd listened to him talk about bridge engineering for years. Now her husband was disabled, the bridge company wanted to replace him, and Emily decided she would become the link between Washington's mind and the construction site. She started studying engineering, materials science, stress calculations. Washington taught her everything he knew. She read his father's notes. She studied the original plans until she understood them as well as anyone. Then she went to the construction site. The workers didn't know what to make of her at first. A woman wearing fashionable dresses showing up to a dirty, dangerous construction site to give orders. In 1872, that was unheard of. But Emily didn't ask for respect. She earned it. She knew the engineering. She could answer technical questions. She carried Washington's instructions precisely, and workers quickly learned that when Emily Roebling said something, it was accurate and important. Every day, she'd visit Washington. He'd give her instructions which cable needed adjusting, where the stone needed reinforcement, what the next phase of construction required. She'd go to the site, oversee the work, answer questions from the foremen, and report back what she'd observed. She became Washington's eyes, his voice, and increasingly, his mind in the field. The workers started calling her the chief engineer, behind her back, half mocking, half genuine respect. The The bridge company tried to replace Washington several times. Each time, Emily defended him. She argued that removing him now would delay the project more than keeping him. She demonstrated her own competence. She made the case that together, she and Washington could finish what his father had started. The company backed down. Emily Roebling, who had no official title, no engineering degree, and no salary, became the de facto leader of America's most ambitious construction project. Meanwhile, down in the Manhattan caisson, men were still dying. The work had reached 70 feet below the surface. The air pressure was enormous. Men could work only 30 to 45 minutes before they had to surface. Even with those short shifts, many were getting sick. The project physician, Dr. Andrew Smith, documented everything. He interviewed sick workers. He tracked symptoms. He tried different treatments, none of which worked because he was treating the symptoms, not the cause. Some of his notes survive. They make difficult reading. Worker complained of extreme pain in both knees, unable to stand, treated with morphine, died 3 days later. Worker collapsed after surfacing, blind in both eyes. Paralysis of legs, condition unchanged after 2 weeks. Worker experienced joint pain but returned to work, collapsed after second shift, dead within hours. These weren't names to Dr. Smith. They were case numbers, symptoms to study, but they were men. They had families. They had children who waited for fathers who didn't come home. Most were immigrants who spoke limited English. They took the dangerous jobs because those were the jobs available. They worked in the caisson because the pay was better than alternatives. They died because going 70 feet underwater in compressed air and coming back up too quickly makes nitrogen bubble in your blood like opening a shaken bottle of soda. Washington Roebling, from his window in Brooklyn Heights, studied the death reports. He understood now what was happening. He understood that compressed air was the cause, that pressure changes were the mechanism. He wrote detailed notes about decompression sickness that were ahead of medical science at the time, but he couldn't stop the work. The bridge had to be finished. The cities needed it. The money had been spent. The political pressure was immense. So he made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. At 78 feet down, with bedrock still not in sight, he ordered them to stop digging. 78 feet wasn't bedrock. It was clay and compacted sand. Not ideal. But Washington calculated that the enormous weight of the tower, thousands of tons of granite, would compress the material enough to make it stable. It was a risk. If he was wrong, the tower could shift, cables could fail, the entire bridge could collapse. But if he kept digging, more men would die, maybe dozens more. And Washington, sick and in pain, directing from a window, couldn't justify more deaths for a foundation he was no longer certain they needed. Work in the Manhattan caisson stopped in May 1872. The final depth, 78 feet 6 inches, not bedrock but close enough. 3 men had died in the Manhattan caisson. More than 100 had been seriously injured. Washington himself was permanently disabled. The foundations were done. Now they had to build upward. Let's talk about who actually built this bridge. Thousands of men worked on the Brooklyn Bridge between 1870 and 1883. Most were immigrants, most were poor, most have been forgotten. The caisson workers got the highest pay for the most dangerous work, $2 a day for risking death from the bends. That's about $50 in today's money, $50 for 8 or 10 hours of working in compressed air that could kill you. Above ground, other workers built the towers. They were stone masons, quarry workers, haulers. They worked with massive granite blocks, each weighing several tons. The stones were cut in quarries, transported by barge, lifted by derricks, and set in place by men who understood how to make stone lock together in structures that would stand for centuries. This work was also dangerous. Men fell from scaffolding, stones shifted and crushed limbs, derricks failed and dropped loads, but it was safer than the caisson and it paid less, about $1.50 a day. Then there were the cable workers. Once the towers were finished, men had to string the cables. 4 massive cables, each made of thousands of steel wires bundled together. The wires had to be strung one at a time, back and forth across the river until the cable was complete. This work happened hundreds of feet in the air. Men rode on small platforms called cradles that traveled along the guide wires. Wind hit them up there, cold bit through their clothes in winter, heat baked them in summer. One slip meant falling into the river or onto the roadway below. E.F. Farrington, the master mechanic who supervised cable work, was the first man to cross the river on the guide wire. He rode in a small bosun's chair, pulled by rope, swinging over the East River while crowds watched from both shores. It was a publicity stunt showing that the wires were safe, but it was also genuinely dangerous. If the wire failed or the chair broke, Farrington would have died. The crowds cheered when he made it to the other side. They didn't think much about the men who'd be doing this same crossing dozens of times a day for months with far less attention and celebration. The cable work took nearly 2 years. Wire by wire, strand by strand, the cables grew. Workers developed techniques for bundling the wires, compressing them, wrapping them in protective coating. It was skilled work requiring precision and courage. One worker, a man named O'Rourke, fell from the cable during construction. He managed to grab a wire on the way down, stopping his fall about 200 feet above the water. He hung there, holding on with both hands while workers rushed to lower a rope to him. It took 15 minutes to get him down. His hands were torn and bleeding from gripping the wire, but he lived. He went back to work the next day. Not everyone was that lucky. The exact death toll during construction is disputed. Official records say about 20 men died, but those records only counted deaths that happened on-site during work hours. They didn't count men who died at home from injuries sustained at work. They didn't count men who died weeks or months later from caisson disease. They didn't count men who fell into the river and whose bodies were never recovered. The real number is probably higher, maybe 30, maybe 40. We'll never know exactly because no one was carefully tracking the lives of immigrant laborers in 1870s New York. What we do know is that for 13 years, men climbed onto this bridge every day knowing they might not climb down. They did it for pay that barely covered rent and food. They did it because they had families to feed. They did it because there were always more workers behind them willing to take the risk if they refused. The bridge was financed by both cities and by private investors. The total cost was about $15 million, roughly $400 million in today's money. That's $400 million for materials, engineering, and labor. The workers who actually built it, who dug in the caissons, who laid the stone, who strung the cables, collectively earned a tiny fraction of that total. Most of them ended the project exactly as poor as they'd started. They traded years of their lives, risked death daily, and left their blood and sometimes their bodies in the foundation of a bridge they couldn't afford to cross by carriage. The newspapers of the time called the bridge a triumph of human ingenuity. They praised the engineering, the vision, the determination. They mentioned Washington Roebling's sacrifice. His disability was public knowledge and made him sympathetic, but the newspapers rarely mentioned the caisson workers by name. They didn't write obituaries for men killed by the bends. They didn't interview families left without fathers. The workers were just part of the machinery, as replaceable as rivets or cable wire. This wasn't unique to the Brooklyn Bridge. Every major construction project in the Gilded Age ran on the same logic. Wealthy people provided capital, engineers provided knowledge, and poor immigrants provided bodies. The system worked because there were always more bodies available. But the Brooklyn Bridge made this especially visible because the danger was so specific and so deadly. The caisson wasn't just dangerous the way construction work is generally dangerous. It was a machine that consumed men, that made them sick in ways doctors couldn't fix, that left them dead or crippled with no compensation and no recognition. And when the bridge finally opened in 1883, when the champagne flowed and the politicians gave speeches, none of them mentioned the graveyard underneath. With the caisson work finished, the towers could finally rise above the river. The Brooklyn Tower was completed first in 1875. It stood 276 feet tall, taller than any building in New York at the time. Gothic arches gave it the appearance of a cathedral. The architect had designed it to be beautiful as well as functional, a monument that would command the skyline for generations. The Manhattan Tower followed in 1876. Identical in design, equally massive. 2 stone sentinels facing each other across the East River, waiting for the cables that would connect them. Building the towers required years of careful, dangerous work. The granite blocks, each weighing several tons, were lifted by steam-powered derricks and set in place by masons who understood how to fit stone together without mortar in the lower sections, then with mortar as the tower rose higher. The workers on the towers faced different dangers than the caisson workers: heights instead of depths, falling instead of the bends, but death was still death, whether from nitrogen bubbles or from hitting the ground after a 100-foot fall. As the towers grew, they became tourist attractions. People came to watch the construction, to marvel at the scale. Artists painted them. Photographers captured them. The towers were beautiful, powerful symbols of American ambition and progress. No one mentioned that several men had died building them. By 1876, the towers stood complete. Now came the most dramatic phase, stringing the cables. The Brooklyn Bridge needed 4 main cables. Each cable would be made of thousands of steel wires bundled together, 19,296 wires per cable, to be exact. The combined cables would support a roadway carrying trains, carriages, and thousands of pedestrians daily. The technique for building the cables was revolutionary. Instead of making the cables elsewhere and trying to lift them into position, impossible at this scale, workers would string the wires one at a time, building the cable in place. First, they established the guide wires, temporary cables strong enough to support the equipment and workers who'd be stringing the permanent wires. E.F. Farrington made his famous ride across on the first guide wire in August 1876. Then the real work began. Workers called wire splicers rode back and forth on small traveling wheels, carrying individual wires. Back and forth, hundreds of times a day, slowly building up the massive cables. The work required perfect coordination. The wires had to be kept at exact tension. They had to be positioned precisely. Any mistake could mean weakness in the cable, which could eventually mean collapse. Weather made everything harder. Summer heat expanded the metal, changing the tension. Winter cold made the steel brittle. Wind shook the wires and the platforms where men worked. Rain made surfaces slippery. The workers developed their own culture and language. They had songs about the bridge. They had superstitions, things you didn't do if you wanted to make it through the day. They looked out for each other because the foremen and engineers couldn't always see what was happening hundreds of feet in the air. Frank Harris, a worker who later became a writer, described the experience in his memoirs. He talked about the fear, constant, controlled, but always there. He talked about the camaraderie among workers who understood they were trusting each other with their lives. He talked about the pride when a section of cable was completed, when you could see the progress you'd made. But he also talked about the men who fell. He described watching a worker lose his grip and drop, tumbling through the air while everyone else froze, unable to help, unable to look away. The cable work continued for nearly 2 years. During that time, workers strung 14,680 miles of wire, enough to stretch more than halfway around the Earth. Every mile represented hours of dangerous work carried out by men making less than $2 a day. Emily Roebling visited the site regularly during this phase. She understood the cable calculations. She could discuss tension and stress with the engineers. The workers grew used to seeing her, this woman in long skirts, climbing onto inspection platforms to check the work. She became something of a legend among the workers. Not because she was friendly, she was professional, focused on the job, but because she was competent. In an era when women weren't supposed to understand mathematics or engineering, Emily Roebling proved she understood both better than most men. Washington, meanwhile, continued directing from his window. He'd set up a telescope that let him observe the bridge from his bedroom in Brooklyn Heights. He could see the towers, the cables, the workers. Emily would bring him reports, and together they'd plan the next phase of work. The marriage had transformed into something unique. They were partners in a way few couples of that era could be. Washington provided the knowledge. Emily provided the mobility and the voice. Together they were the bridge's true architect, one mind working through 2 bodies. By 1878, the cables were complete. 4 massive steel cables, each 15.75 inches in diameter, strong enough to support the roadway and all the weight it would carry. Now came the final phase, building the roadway itself. The roadway would hang from the cables, suspended by vertical cables called suspenders. The roadway itself would be made of steel and wood, with 2 levels, trains on the lower level, carriages and pedestrians on the upper. But before construction could proceed, a scandal broke that threatened the entire project. The steel wire used in the cables was supposed to meet strict quality standards. Washington had specified exactly what kind of steel was required, what strength it needed, what tests it had to pass. In 1878, inspectors discovered that the contractor, J. Lloyd Hague, had been delivering substandard wire. Some of it was weaker than specified. Some of it had been rejected in earlier tests but was delivered anyway and hidden among the good wire. Hague had been substituting cheap wire for good wire and pocketing the difference. Thousands of feet of substandard wire were already woven into the cables. Removing it was impossible. The cables were already complete. Taking them apart would mean starting over, adding years to the project. Washington calculated the risk. The cables had been designed with a safety factor of 6, meaning they were 6 times stronger than they needed to be. Even with the substandard wire, the safety factor was still about 4. The bridge would still be safe, but the scandal damaged public trust. Newspapers accused the bridge company of corruption and incompetence. Politicians demanded investigations. Some called for the project to be abandoned. Washington and Emily defended the bridge. They showed the calculations proving it was still safe. They pushed for continued construction, and eventually the furor died down. Haig was quietly removed from the project. The substandard wire stayed in the cables, and construction continued. By 1883, the roadway was complete. The bridge was ready to open, 13 years after construction began. 13 years since the Brooklyn caisson first descended into the riverbed. 13 years since the first men climbed down into compressed air and started digging. The project had cost $15 million. It had employed thousands of workers. It had pioneered new engineering techniques. It had made Emily Roebling famous as the woman who'd helped build it. It had left Washington Roebling a permanent invalid. And it had killed at least 20 men, probably more. Men whose names appeared in no speeches, whose families received no compensation, whose graves bore no mention of the bridge they died building. The opening ceremony was scheduled for May 24, 1883. May 24, 1883. Perfect spring weather, clear skies, warm sun, a breeze off the river. Crowds began gathering at dawn. By mid-morning, an estimated 150,000 people had packed onto both sides of the river to watch the opening ceremony. The official program was planned down to the minute. President Chester Arthur would attend, the governors of New York and New Jersey, the mayors of Brooklyn and New York. Bands would play, speeches would be given. Fireworks would mark the evening celebration. Washington Roebling watched from his window. He was too ill to attend the ceremony. 13 years of work, 13 years of sacrifice, and he couldn't even be present at the triumph. Emily attended in his place. She rode in the first carriage to cross the completed bridge, carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory, an old engineering tradition. As the carriage rolled across, crowds on both shores erupted in cheers. She was the only person in that carriage who understood every detail of the bridge's construction. She knew which cables held which weight, where the stress points were, which sections had given them trouble. She knew the names of some of the workers who'd built it. She knew what it had cost in money, in lives, in her husband's health. President Arthur gave a speech praising American ingenuity and determination. He called the bridge a monument to progress. He thanked Washington Roebling for his dedication and sacrifice. He didn't mention the caisson workers. He didn't mention the men who died from the bends. He didn't mention the men who fell from the cables. He didn't mention the immigrant laborers who'd done the actual physical work of digging, hauling, lifting, and building. The politicians saw the bridge as proof of American greatness. The engineers saw it as a triumph of calculation and planning. The investors saw it as a profitable connection between two growing cities. The workers, those who survived, saw their own blood and sweat transformed into stone and steel, now being celebrated by people who'd never spent a single day in a caisson or on a cable. After the speeches, the bridge was opened to the public. Pedestrians flooded onto the walkway. Carriages rolled across. Trains began running on the lower level. The East River crossing that had frustrated generations was finally solved. The newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. Harper's Weekly ran illustrations of the celebration. Poems were written about the bridge's beauty and symbolic importance. Not a single major newspaper mentioned the death toll. Not one editorial asked about the workers who died. The triumph was complete and untarnished by inconvenient facts about how it had actually been achieved. Washington Roebling lived another 43 years after the bridge opened. He never fully recovered from caisson disease. He remained partially paralyzed, in chronic pain, his vision and memory permanently damaged. He spent most of his time in his house in Trenton, New Jersey, reading, studying, and corresponding with other engineers. He was famous as the man who built the Brooklyn Bridge. Journalists wanted to interview him. Engineers wanted his advice. He was respected, celebrated, honored, but he never forgot the cost. In his private writings, he returned again and again to the caisson workers, the men who'd gotten sick, the men who'd died. He described the symptoms in clinical detail. He analyzed what had gone wrong. He tried to understand the mechanisms better so future engineers could protect their workers. He knew the bridge was safe, his calculations had been correct, but he also knew it stood on a foundation of broken bodies and lost lives. Emily Roebling became a celebrity in her own right. She was profiled in magazines as the woman who built a bridge. She gave speeches about women's capability in technical fields. She became an advocate for women's education. In 1899, she earned a law certificate from New York University, one of the few women of her generation to receive legal training. She continued to study mathematics and engineering for the rest of her life. She died in 1903 at age 59. Her obituaries focused on her role in the bridge, calling her the first woman engineer and the invisible builder of the Brooklyn Bridge. Washington outlived her by 23 years. He died in 1926 at age 89, having survived long enough to see the bridge he built become a permanent icon of New York. But what about the workers? Most disappeared from history. We don't know what happened to the men who survived the caissons. We don't know how many lived with permanent injuries, how many died young from complications, how many spent their remaining years in pain. We know some names from death records and newspaper reports. John Smith died in the Brooklyn caisson, 1870. Michael Gilligan died from caisson disease, 1871. Patrick McKay fell from the cable, 1877. But most are lost. They have no monuments, their families scattered. Their graves, if they could afford graves, are unmarked or forgotten. The bridge still stands. It carries cars now instead of carriages. It's been renovated, reinforced, and restored dozens of times. The original roadway has been replaced. The cables have been maintained. The stone towers have been cleaned and repaired. But the foundation remains exactly where those workers put it. The caissons are still there, buried in the riverbed. The men who died building them are still there too, not literally in most cases, but spiritually, metaphorically. The bridge sits on their sacrifice. Let's talk about what the bridge actually cost. The official budget was $15 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $400 million in today's money. The cities split the cost. Brooklyn paid more initially, but after the consolidation of New York City in 1898, it all came from the same treasury. That $15 million covered materials, equipment, and labor. It covered the salaries of engineers and administrators. It covered the stone, the steel, the timber, the cables. Every itemized expense went into the official accounting, but what didn't go into the accounting was the real cost paid by the workers. The men in the caissons earned about $2 a day. If they got sick, they received no compensation. If they died, their families got nothing. If they were injured and couldn't work, they were simply replaced. The men who built the towers, strung the cables, and constructed the roadway earned even less, $1.50 to $1.75 a day. For that wage, they worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day, in conditions that were constantly dangerous. Added up over 13 years. Thousands of workers, each earning a fraction of what the project cost overall, collectively receiving maybe 10% of the total budget while providing 100% of the physical labor that made the bridge exist. The engineers and administrators were paid far better. Washington Roebling earned several $1,000s a year. Emily received no salary but had access to Washington's income. The chief assistants and senior engineers earned comfortable salaries that placed them in the middle class. The gap between top and bottom wasn't as extreme as modern corporate pay gaps, but the principle was the same. The people who actually did the dangerous work earned the least and took the greatest risks. This was normal for the time. Labor was cheap. Workers had no rights to speak of. Unions existed but were weak and often violently suppressed. An injured worker could sue for compensation, but lawsuits were expensive and rarely successful. So the bridge company had no incentive to protect workers beyond the minimum necessary to keep construction moving. If men got sick in the caissons, there were always more men looking for work. If men fell from the cables, the foreman hired replacements and the work continued. The only thing that finally stopped the caisson work wasn't concern for the workers. It was Washington Roebling's calculation that continuing would kill more men than the foundation was worth. Even then, the decision was about engineering judgment, not ethics. Washington cared about his workers more than many engineers of his era, but he still made the choice within a framework where worker deaths were expected and acceptable costs. The bridge's legacy is complicated. It's genuinely a marvel of engineering. It pioneered techniques still used today. It proved that suspension bridges could span distances previously thought impossible. It's beautiful, iconic, and has served New York well for more than 140 years. But it's also a monument to the Gilded Age's casual cruelty. To a time when ambitious projects were built on immigrant bodies with no safety regulations, no worker protections, and no accountability when people died. We celebrate the bridge. We should. It's worth celebrating. But we should also remember what it actually cost and who actually paid. Walk the Brooklyn Bridge on any given day. Tourists clog the pedestrian walkway, taking photos of the Manhattan skyline. Locals jog past them, annoyed at having to dodge selfie sticks. Cyclists ring bells trying to navigate through the crowds. The view is spectacular. The towers still command attention, Gothic arches framing the modern skyscrapers beyond. The steel cables still hold firm, carrying traffic that their designers couldn't have imagined: buses, trucks, thousands of cars daily. It's become so familiar that it's easy to forget how radical it once was. The Brooklyn Bridge was the longest suspension bridge in the world for 20 years. It proved that steel cables could support enormous weight. It showed that suspension bridges were practical for major urban crossings. Every suspension bridge built since owes something to the techniques pioneered here. The Golden Gate Bridge, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, modern bridges in China, Japan, and Europe. They all trace their lineage back to the Brooklyn Bridge and the Roebling's innovations. But walk the bridge with knowledge of its history and you see it differently. The stones under your feet quarried and set by men making $1.50 a day. The cables above strung by workers risking falls from heights that would kill them instantly. The towers built on foundations dug by men who descended into compressed air chambers and often didn't come back up healthy. There's no plaque mentioning the deaths, no memorial for the workers. The bridge celebrates its designers: John Roebling, Washington Roebling, Emily Roebling. Their names appear in histories and guidebooks. Their sacrifices are acknowledged. The workers who actually built it remain mostly anonymous. In recent years, historians have tried to recover some of those lost stories. They've searched death records, immigration documents, newspaper archives. They've found some names, some details, but most of the workers are still lost to history. This is the pattern with Gilded Age monuments. We remember the visionaries, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the Roeblings. We remember the architects and engineers. We sometimes remember the scandals and the corruption. We forget the bodies. The Brooklyn Bridge is celebrated in books, films, art, and popular culture. It's appeared in countless movies, always as a symbol of New York, of ambition, of human achievement. Poets have written about it. Walt Whitman called it the best, most effective medicine my soul has yet partaken. Hart Crane wrote an entire epic poem, The Bridge, using it as a symbol of connection and possibility. The celebrations are deserved in many ways. The bridge is beautiful. It does connect. It did represent something new, proof that American engineers could match or exceed European achievements. But the romantic vision of the bridge erases the reality of how it was built. When we admire the bridge as a symbol of achievement, we're implicitly accepting that achievement requires sacrifice. When we celebrate it without mentioning the workers who died, we're saying those deaths were acceptable costs. This isn't unique to the Brooklyn Bridge. Every major construction project from that era, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Erie Canal, the Panama Canal, has a similar story. Grand visions realized through grinding labor, progress built on broken bodies. The difference is a matter of honesty about the costs. Some monuments acknowledge their dark history. The September 11 Memorial lists the names of everyone who died. Holocaust memorials name victims. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial inscribes the fallen. The Brooklyn Bridge has no such acknowledgement. It's presented as pure triumph, unmarked by the suffering that made it possible. Should it be different? Should there be a memorial to the workers who died? Some say yes. They argue that honesty requires acknowledging the full cost. That the men who died deserve recognition. That visitors should understand what the bridge actually represents, not just engineering genius, but also the Gilded Age's ruthless exploitation of immigrant labor. Others argue that adding a memorial now would be symbolic at best. The workers are long dead, their families have scattered. A plaque wouldn't change what happened or bring anyone back. The bridge already exists. Its meaning is already established in public consciousness, but symbols matter. Memorials shape how we understand history. What we choose to remember tells us what we value. Right now, we value the engineering. We value the vision. We value Washington and Emily Roebling's perseverance. We value the bridge as a connection between boroughs, as a symbol of New York, as an architectural landmark. We don't value, or at least we don't acknowledge, the immigrant workers who made it all possible. We don't acknowledge the men who died in the caissons. We don't acknowledge the families left without fathers. We don't acknowledge that the bridge was possible because labor was cheap and lives were cheaper. Maybe that should change. So what do we learn from the bridge built over dead bodies? First, great achievements often have hidden costs. The Brooklyn Bridge is beautiful and functional and historically significant. It's also a monument to exploitation. Both things are true simultaneously. Second, who gets remembered depends on power. The Roeblings are famous because they had status. The workers are forgotten because they didn't. This isn't natural or inevitable. It's a choice about whose stories we think matter. Third, engineering isn't neutral. The decision to build the bridge, the decision about how much to spend on worker safety, the decision to keep working even after men started dying, these were all choices made by people with power. Framing them as engineering problems rather than ethical problems is itself a political act. Fourth, progress has a price tag and we need to ask who pays. The Brooklyn Bridge made travel easier between Manhattan and Brooklyn. It increased property values, it facilitated economic growth, but the people who benefited most weren't the ones who paid the highest price. Fifth, invisibility is constructed, not natural. The workers aren't forgotten by accident. They're forgotten because the people telling the story chose to emphasize other elements. Making them visible again requires deliberate effort. Stand on the Brooklyn Bridge walkway. Look down at the water. Think about the men who descended into the darkness beneath that water, who dug in compressed air chambers, who suffered and died so that you could stand here admiring the view. Think about Emily Roebling, the woman who became an engineer when women weren't allowed to be engineers, who saved the project when her husband couldn't lead it, who proved competence mattered more than gender. Think about Washington Roebling, who survived the caissons but never really left them, who spent 43 years living with pain because he'd exposed himself to the same dangers he'd asked workers to face. Think about the bridge itself, this beautiful, functional monument that has served New York for 141 years and will probably serve for another century at least. All of these things are part of the same story. The triumph and the tragedy, the beauty and the cost, the monument and the graveyard underneath. The Brooklyn Bridge is exactly what we make it, a symbol of achievement, a reminder of exploitation, a celebration of engineering. A memorial to forgotten workers, an icon of New York, a cautionary tale about the price of progress. It's all of these things at once. And the question isn't which interpretation is correct, they all are. The question is which ones we choose to acknowledge and which we pretend don't exist. Every time you cross the Brooklyn Bridge, you're traveling over the foundation dug by men who died in caissons. You're walking beneath cables strung by workers who risked deadly falls. You're using a structure made possible by immigrant labor that was paid a fraction of its value. You can ignore that history. You can focus only on the beauty and the engineering triumph. That's what most people do. Or you can remember. You can acknowledge that great things often come at great cost. You can honor the people who paid that cost even if their names are lost. The bridge doesn't change either way. It still stands, solid and beautiful, connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn just as it was designed to do. What changes is how we understand it. And how we understand it shapes what we're willing to accept in the future, what costs seem reasonable, whose sacrifices seem necessary, whose names deserve to be remembered. The bridge they built over dead bodies still carries traffic today. The question is whether we're willing to look down and see the foundation, or whether we'll just keep our eyes on the skyline ahead, admiring the view and forgetting what holds it up.